elaborated, which does not destroy, but supports governments. Now there is something more for the government to encourage peace. Peace. The sovereigns who nowadays take counsel with their ministers decide by their will alone whether the butchery of millions is to be begun this year or next. They know very well that all these discourses upon peace will not hinder them from sending millions of men to butchery when it seems good to them. They listen even with satisfaction to these discourses, encourage them, and take part in them. All this, far from being detrimental, is even of service to governments, by turning people's attention from the most important and pressing question: ought or ought not each man called upon for military service to submit to serve in the army? Beginning of quotation. Peace will soon be arranged, thanks to alliances and congresses, to books and pamphlets. Meantime, go and put on your uniform and prepare to cause suffering and to endure it for our benefit. End of quotation. Is the government's line of argument, and the learned gentlemen who get up congresses and write articles are in perfect agreement with it. This is the attitude of one set of thinkers, and since it is that most beneficial to governments, it is also the most encouraged by all intelligent governments. Another attitude to war has something tragical in it. There are men who maintain that the love for peace and the inevitability of war form a hideous contradiction, that such is the fate of man. These are mostly gifted and sensitive men who see and realize all the horror and imbecility and cruelty of war, but through some strange perversion of mind neither see nor seek to find any way out of this position, and seem to take pleasure in teasing the wound by dwelling on the desperate position of humanity. A notable example of such an attitude to war is to be found in the celebrated French writer Guy de Maupassant. Looking down from his yacht at the drill and firing practice of the French soldiers, the following reflections occur to him. Beginning of quotation. When I think only of this word war, a kind of terror seizes upon me, as though I were listening to some tale of sorcery, of the Inquisition, some long past remote abomination, monstrous, unnatural. When cannibalism is spoken of, we smile with pride, proclaiming our superiority to these savages. Which are the savages, the real savages, those who fight to eat the conquered, or those who fight to kill for nothing but to kill? The young recruits moving about in lines yonder are destined to death like the flocks of sheep driven by the butcher along the road. They will fall in some plain with a saber cut in the head or a bullet through the breast, and these are young men who might work, be productive and useful. Their fathers are old and poor. Their mothers, who have loved them for 20 years and worshipped them as none but mothers can, will learn in 6 months' time, or a year perhaps, that their son, their boy, the big boy reared with so much labor, so much expense, so much love, has been thrown in a hole like some dead dog, after being disemboweled by a bullet and trampled, crushed to a mass of pulp by the charges of cavalry. Why have they killed her boy, her handsome boy, her one hope, her pride, her life? She does not know. Ah, why? War, fighting, slaughter, massacres of men, and we have now in our century, with our civilization, with the spread of science and the degree of philosophy which the genius of man is supposed to have attained, schools for training to kill very far off, to perfection, great numbers at once, to kill poor devils of innocent men with families and without any kind of trial. And what is most bewildering is that the people do not rise against their governments. For what difference is there between monarchies and republics? The most bewildering thing is that the whole of society is not in revolt at the word war. Ah, we shall always live under the burden of the ancient and odious customs, the criminal prejudices, the ferocious ideas of our barbarous ancestors. For we are beasts, and beasts we shall remain, dominated by instinct and changed by nothing. Would not any other man than Victor Hugo have been exiled for that mighty cry of deliverance and truth? Today force is called violence and is being brought to judgment. War has been put on its trial. At the plea of the human race, civilization arraigns warfare and draws up the general list of crimes laid at the charge of conquerors and generals. The nations are coming to understand that the magnitude of a crime cannot be its extenuation, that if killing is a crime, killing many can be no extenuating circumstance, that if robbery is disgraceful, invasion cannot be glorious. Ah, let us proclaim these absolute truths. Let us dishonor war. Vain wrath, continues Maupassant, a poet's indignation. War is held in more veneration than ever. A skilled proficient in that line, a slaughterer of genius, Van Moltke, in reply to the peer delegates, once uttered these strange words. War is holy, war is ordained of God. It is one of the most sacred laws of the world. It maintains among men all the great and noble sentiments, honor, devotion, virtue, and courage, and saves them in short time falling from the most hideous materialism. So then, bringing millions of men together into herds, marching by day and by night without rest, thinking of nothing, studying nothing, learning nothing, reading nothing, being useful to no one, wallowing in filth, sleeping in mud, living like brutes in a continual state of stupefaction, sacking towns, burning villages, ruining whole populations, then meeting another mass of human flesh, falling upon them, making pools of blood and plains of flesh mixed with trodden mire and red with heaps of corpses, having your arms or legs carried off, your brains blown out for no advantage to anyone, and dying in some corner of a field while your old parents, your wife and children are perishing of hunger. That is what is meant by not falling into the most hideous materialism. Warriors are not the scourge of the world. We struggle against nature and ignorance and obstacles of all kinds to make our wretched life less hard. Learned men, benefactors of all, spend their lives in working and seeking what can aid, what can be of use, what can alleviate the lot of their fellows. They devote themselves unsparingly to their task of usefulness, making one discovery after another, enlarging the sphere of human intelligence, extending the bounds of science, and adding each day some new store to the sum of knowledge, gaining each day prosperity, ease, strength for their country. War breaks out. In 6 months the generals have destroyed the work of 20 years of effort, of patience, and of genius. That is what is meant by not falling into the most hideous materialism. We have seen it, war. We have seen men turn to brutes, frenzied, killing for fun, for terror, for bravado, for ostentation. Then what is right is no more. Law is dead. Every notion of justice has disappeared. We have seen men shoot innocent creatures found on the road and suspected because they were afraid. We have seen them kill dogs chained at their master's door to try their new revolvers. We have seen them fire on cows lying in a field for no reason whatever, simply for the sake of shooting, for a joke. That is what is meant by not falling into the most hideous materialism. Going into a country, cutting the man's throat who defends his house because he wears a blouse and has not a military cap on his head, burning the dwellings of wretched beings who have nothing to eat, breaking furniture and stealing goods, drinking the wine found in the cellars, violating the women in the streets, burning thousands of francs worth of powder, and leaving misery and cholera in one's track. That is what is meant by not falling into the most hideous materialism. What have they done, these warriors, those warriors, that proves the least intelligence? Nothing. What have they invented? Cannons and muskets. That is all. What remains to us from Greece? Books and statues. Is Greece great from her conquests or her creations? Was it the invasions of the Persians which saved Greece from falling into the most hideous materialism? Were the invasions of the barbarians what saved and regenerated Rome? Was it Napoleon I who carried forward the great intellectual movement started by the philosophers of the end of the last century? Yes, indeed, since government assumes the right of annihilating peoples thus, there is nothing surprising in the fact that people assume the rights of annihilating governments. They defend themselves. They are right. No one has an absolute right to govern others. It ought only to be done for the benefit of those who are governed. And it is as much the duty of anyone who governs to avoid war as it is the duty of a captain of a ship to avoid shipwreck. When a captain has let his ship come to ruin, he is judged and condemned if he is found guilty of negligence or even incapacity. Why should not the government be put on its trial after every declaration of war? If the people understood that if they themselves pass judgment on murderous governments, if they refuse to let themselves be killed for nothing, if they would only turn their arms against those who have given them to them for massacre, on that day war would be no more. But that day will never come. End of quotation. Footnote, Sur l'eau, pages 71 through 80. The author sees all the horror of war. He sees that it is ceased by governments forcing men by deception to go out to slaughter and be slain without any advantage to themselves. And he sees, too, that the men who make up the armies could turn their arms against the governments and bring them to judgment. But he thinks that that will never come to pass, and that there is therefore no escape from the present position. Beginning of quotation. quotation. I think war is terrible, but that it is inevitable, that compulsory military service is as inevitable as death, and that since government will always desire it, war will always exist. End of quotation. So writes this talented and sincere writer, who is endowed with that power of penetrating the innermost crust of the subject which is the essence of the poetic faculty. He brings before us all the cruelty of the inconsistency between man's moral sense and their actions, but without trying to remove it. Seems to admit that this inconsistency must exist, and that it is the poetic tragedy of life. Another no less gifted writer, Edouard Rod, paints in still more vivid colors the cruelty and madness of the present state of things. He too only aims at presenting its tragic features without suggesting or foreseeing any issue from the position. Beginning of quotation. What is the good of doing anything? What is the good of undertaking any enterprise? And how are we to love men in these troubled times when every fresh day is a menace of danger? All we have begun, the plans we are developing, our schemes of work, the little good we may have been able to do, will it not all be swept away by the tempest that is in preparation? Everywhere the earth is shaking under our feet, and storm clouds are gathering on our horizon, which will have no pity on us. Ah, if all we had to dread were the revolution which is held up as a spectre to terrify us. Since I cannot imagine a society more detestable than ours, I feel more skeptical than alarmed in regard to that which will replace it. If I should have to suffer from the change, I should be consoled by thinking that the executioners of that day were the victims of the previous time, and the hope of something better would help us to endure the worst. But it is not that remote peril which frightens me. I see another danger, nearer and far more cruel. More cruel because there is no excuse for it, because it is absurd, because it can lead to no good. Every day one balances the chances of war on the morrow. Every day they become more merciless. The imagination revolts before the catastrophe which is coming at the end of our century as the goal of the progress of our era. And yet we must get used to facing it. For 20 years past, every resource of science has been exhausted in the invention of engines of destruction, and soon a few charges of cannon will suffice to annihilate a whole army. No longer a few thousand of poor devils who were paid a price for their blood are kept under arms, but whole nations are under arms to cut each other's throats. They are robbed of their time now by compulsory service, that they may be robbed of their lives later. To persuade them for the work of massacre, their hatred is kindled by persuading them that they are hated. And peaceable men let themselves be played on thus, and go and fall on one another with the ferocity of wild beasts. Furious troops of peaceful citizens taking up arms at an empty word of command. For some ridiculous question of frontiers or colonial trade interests, heaven only knows what, they will go like sheep to the slaughter, knowing all the while where they are going, knowing that they are leaving their wives, knowing that their children will want for food, full of misgivings, yet intoxicated by the fine-sounding lies that are dinned into their ears. They will march without revolt, passive, resigned, though the numbers and the strength are theirs, and they might, if they knew how to cooperate together, establish the reign of good sense and fraternity instead of the barbarous trickery of diplomacy. They will march to battle so deluded, so duped, that they will believe slaughter to be a duty, and they will ask the benediction of God on their lust for blood. They will march to battle trampling underfoot the harvests they have sown, burning the towns they have built with songs of triumph, festive music, and cries of jubilation, and their sons will raise statues to these who have done most in their slaughter. The destiny of a whole generation depends on the hour in which some ill-fated politician may give the signal that will be followed. We know that the best of us will be cut down and our work will be destroyed in embryo. We know it and tremble with rage, but we can do nothing. We are held fast in the toils of officialdom and red tape, and too rude a shock would be needed to set us free. We are enslaved by the laws we set up for our protection, which have become our oppression. We are but the tools of that autocratic abstraction, the state, which enslaves each individual in the name of the will of all, who would all, taken individually, desire exactly the opposite of what they will be made to do. And if it were only a generation that must be sacrificed. But there are graver interests at stake. The paid politicians, the ambitious statesmen who exploit the evil passions of the populace, and the imbeciles who are deluded by fine-sounding phrases, have so embittered international feuds, that the existence of a whole race will be at stake in the war of the morrow. One of the elements that constitute the modern world is threatened. The conquered people will be wiped out of existence, and whichever it may be, we shall see a moral force annihilated, as if there were too many forces to work for good. We shall have a new Europe, formed on foundations so unjust, so brutal, so sanguinary, stained with so monstrous a crime, that it cannot but be worse than the Europe of today, more iniquitous, more barbarous, more violent. Thus one feels crushed under the weight of an immense discouragement. We are struggling in a cul-de-sac with muskets aimed at us from the housetops. Our labor is like that of sailors executing their last task as the ship begins to sink. Our pleasures are those of the condemned victim, who is offered his choice of dainties a quarter of an hour before his execution. Thought is paralyzed by anguish, and the most it is capable of is to calculate, interpreting the vague phrases of ministers, spelling out the sense of the speeches of the sovereigns, and ruminating on the words attributed to diplomatists, reported on the uncertain authority of the newspapers, whether it is to be tomorrow or the day after, this year or the next, that we are to be murdered, so that one might seek in vain in history an epoch more insecure, more crushed under the weight of suffering. End of quotation. Footnote, Leçons de la Vie, pages 208 through 213. Here it is pointed out that the force is in the hands of those who work their own destruction, in the hands of the individual men who make up the masses. It is pointed out that the source of the evil is the government. It would seem evident that the contradiction between life and conscience has reached the limit beyond which it cannot go, and after reaching this limit, some solution of it must be found. But the author does not think so. He sees in this the tragedy of human life, and after depicting all the horror of the position, he concludes that human life must be spent in the midst of this horror. So much for the attitude to war of those who regard it as something tragic and fated by destiny. The third category consists of men who have lost all conscience and consequently all common sense and feeling of humanity. To this category belongs Moltke, whose opinion has been quoted above by Maupassant, and the majority of military men who have been educated in this cruel superstition, live by it, and consequently are often in all simplicity convinced that war is not only an inevitable, but even a necessary and beneficial thing. This is also the view of some civilians, some so-called educated and cultivated people. Here is what the celebrated academician Camille Doucet writes in reply to the editor of the Revue des Revues, where several letters on war were published together. Beginning of quotation. Dear Sir, when you ask the least warlike of academicians whether he is a partisan of war, his answer is known beforehand. Alas, sir, you yourself speak of the pacific ideal inspiring your generous compatriots as a dream. During my life I have heard a great many good people protest against this frightful custom of international butchery, which all admit and deplore. But how is it to be remedied? Often, too, there have been attempts to suppress dueling. One would fancy that seemed an easy task, but not at all. All that has been done hitherto with that noble object has never been and never will be of use. All the congresses of both hemispheres may vote against war, and against dueling, too. But above all arbitrations, conventions, and legislations, there will always be the personal honor of individual men, which has always demanded dueling, and the interest of nations, which will always demand war. I wish none the less from the depths of my heart that the Congress of Universal Peace may succeed at last in its very honorable and difficult enterprise. I am, dear sir, etc., Camille Doucet. End of quotation. The upshot of this is that personal honor requires men to fight, and the interests of nations require them to ruin and exterminate each other. As for the efforts to abolish war, they call for nothing but a smile. The opinion of another well-known academician, Jules Claretier, is of the same kind. Beginning of quotation. Dear sir, he writes, for a man of sense there can be but one opinion on the subject of peace and war. Humanity is created to live free, to perfect and ameliorate its fate by peaceful labor. The general harmony preached by the Universal Peace Congress is but a dream, perhaps, but at least it is the fairest of all dreams. Man is always looking toward the promised land, and there the harvests are to ripen with no fear of their being torn up by shells or crushed by cannon wheels. But since philosophers and philanthropists are not the controlling powers, it is well for our soldiers to guard our frontier and homes, and their arms, skillfully used, are perhaps the surest guarantee of the peace we all love. Peace is a gift only granted to the strong and to the resolute. I am, dear sir, etc., Jules Clarity. End of quotation. The upshot of this letter is that there is no harm in talking about what no one intends or feels obliged to do, but when it comes to practice, we must fight. And here it now is the view lately expressed by the most popular novelist in Europe, Émile Zola. I regard war as a fatal necessity which appears inevitable for us from its close connection with human nature and the whole constitution of the world. I should wish that war could be put off for the longest possible time. Nevertheless, the moment will come when we shall be forced to go to war. I am considering it at this moment from the standpoint of universal humanity, and making no reference to our misunderstanding with Germany, a most trivial incident in the history of mankind. I say that war is necessary and beneficial, since it seems one of the conditions of existence for humanity. War confronts us everywhere, not only war between different races and peoples, but war too in private and family life. It seems one of the principal elements of progress, and every step in advance that has taken hitherto has been attended by bloodshed. Men have talked and still talk of disarmament, while disarmament is something impossible, to which even if it were possible, we ought not to consent. I am convinced that a general disarmament throughout the world would involve something like a moral decadence, which would show itself in general feebleness and would hinder the progressive advancement of humanity. A warlike nation has always been strong and flourishing. The art of war has led to the development of all the other arts. History bears witness to it. So in Athens and in Rome, commerce, manufactures, and literature never attained so high a point of development as when those cities were masters of the whole world by force of arms. To take an example from times nearer our own, we may recall the age of Louis XIV. The wars of the Grand Monarch were not only no hindrance to the progress of the arts and sciences, but even on the contrary seemed to have promoted and favored their development. End of quotation. So war is a beneficial thing, but the best expression of this attitude is the view of the most gifted of the writers of this school, the academician Duvergue. This is what he writes in an article on the military section of the exhibition of 1889. Beginning of quotation. On the Esplanade des Invalides, among the exotic and colonial encampments, a building in a more severe style overawes the picturesque bazaar. All these fragments of the globe have come to gather round the Palace of War, and in turn our guests mount guard submissively before the mother building, but for whom they could not be here. Fine subject for the antithesis of rhetoric of humanitarians who could not fail to whimper over this juxtaposition, and to say that ceci tuera cela. Footnote. Phrase quoted from Victor Hugo, Notre Dame de Paris. End of footnote. That the union of the nations through science and labor will overcome the instinct of war. Let us leave them to cherish the chimera of a golden age, which would soon become, if it could be realized, an age of mud. All history teaches us that the one is created for the other, that blood is needed to hasten and cement the union of the nations. Natural science has ratified in our day the mysterious law revealed to Joseph de Maistre by the intuition of his genius and meditation on fundamental truths. He saw the world redeeming itself from hereditary degenerations by sacrifice. Science shows it advancing to perfection through struggle and violent selection. There is the statement of the same law in both, expressed in different formulas. The statement is disagreeable, no doubt, but the laws of the world are not made for our pleasure. They are made for our progress. Let us enter this inevitable, necessary palace of war. We shall be able to observe there how the most tenacious of our instincts, without losing any of its vigor, is transformed and adapted to the varying exigencies of historical epochs. End of quotation. Monsieur Duvergue finds the necessity of war, according to his views, well expressed by the two great writers, Joseph de Maistre and Darwin, whose statements he likes so much that he quotes them again. Beginning of quotation. Dear Sir, he writes to the editor of the Revue des Revues, you ask me my view as to the possible success of the Universal Congress of Peace. I hold with Darwin that violent struggle is a law of nature which overrules all other laws. I hold with Joseph de Maistre that it is a divine law, two different ways of describing the same thing. If by some impossible chance a fraction of human society, all the civilized West, let us suppose, were to succeed in suspending the action of this law, some races of stronger instincts would undertake the task of putting it into action against us. Those races would vindicate nature's reasoning against human reason. They would be successful because of the certainty of peace. I do not say peace, I say the certainty of peace. Would in half a century engender a corruption and a decadence more destructive for mankind than the worst of wars. I believe that we must do with war the criminal law of humanity, as with all our criminal laws, that is, soften them, put them in force as rarely as possible, use every effort to make their application unnecessary. All the experience of history teaches us that they cannot be altogether suppressed, so long as two men are left on earth with bread, money, and a woman between them. I should be very happy if the Congress would prove me in error, but I doubt if it can prove history, nature, and God in error also. I am, dear sir, etc., E.M. du Vogue. End of quotation. This amounts to saying that history, human nature, and God show us that so long as there are two men and bread, money, and women, there will be war. That is to say, that no progress will lead men to rise above the savage conception of life which regards no participation of bread, money is good in this context, and women possible without fighting. They are strange people, these men who assemble in congresses and make speeches to show us how to catch birds by putting salt on their tails, though they must know it is not impossible to do it. And amazing are they, too, who, like Maupassant, Rode, and many others, see clearly all the horror of war, all the inconsistency of men not doing what is needful, right, and beneficial for them to do, who lament over the tragedy of life and do not see that the whole tragedy is at an end directly men ceasing to take account of any necessary considerations, refuse to do what is hateful and disastrous to them. They are amazing people truly, but those who, like de Vogue and others, who professing the doctrine of evolution regard war as not only inevitable but beneficial and therefore desirable, they are terrible, hideous in their moral perversion. The others at least say that they hate evil and love good, but these openly declare that good and evil do not exist. All the discussion of the possibility of re-establishing peace instead of everlasting war is the pernicious sentimentality of phrase-mongers. There is a law of evolution by which it follows that I must live and act in an evil way. What is to be done? I am an educated man. I know the law of evolution, and therefore I will act in an evil way. Entrant au palais de la guerre. There is the law of evolution, and therefore there is neither good nor evil, and one must live for the sake of one's personal existence, leaving the rest to the action of the law of evolution. This is the last word of refined culture, and with it of that overshadowing of conscience which has come upon the educated classes of our time. The desire of the educated classes to support the ideas they prefer, and the order of existence based on them, has attained its furthest limits. They lie and delude themselves and one another with the subtlest forms of deception simply to obscure, to deaden conscience. Instead of transforming their life into harmony with their conscience, they try by every means to stifle its voice. But it is in darkness that the light begins to shine, and so the light is rising upon our epoch. The end of chapter 6.